a general election. Lots could change, but it does show that reform ceiling is perhaps a lot higher than we originally thought.
And just forgive the question. In 10 seconds, what's it going to take reform to that next level?
I think it's the credibility thing. They've now got to show people they're serious about government. They've got the momentum. They need the credibility.
Okay. All right, Luke, lovely to talk to you. Let's do it again next week. We have so much to talk about, well, with each other and with you on Pienaar and Friends coming up in just a moment. Stay with us, and we are going to be streaming live on YouTube. Do tune in there.
Across the UK, on DAB,
Text me a tweet and we can chat after the news with Mike Powell.
Thank you, John. The Chancellor says she's absolutely committed to spending to on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It is really good to have you with us on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company, which tonight is Rachel Sylvester from The Times back with us. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, John.
Lovely to see you. And Joe Tanner here too, political communications strategist and sage. Hello, Joe.
Oh, hello, John.
Can I come to you first, Joe, for your thought for the day?
OK, I've got a bit of a left field one, but I was shocked to learn, as I'm sure some other listeners have heard, that at a time when we perhaps need him, we've sold our best spy to Amazon. And there's been this deal done by the folks behind Bond. And it's been, the rights have been sold to Amazon now.
Right.
So there's been a bit of a sort of a bit of noise online where people that are big fans are saying, oh, they're just going to break this up a bit like they did with Star Wars, with all these sort of spin-offs about, you know, Q or weird products maybe appearing on Amazon, etc. But there's been a bit of slightly negative sort of feeling about it, because there's always sort of suspicion when these other firms sort of come in and what they do, and will they just sort of break up rather than one big film that everyone has the anticipation about? Is it that you get these lots of little spin-off series, for example, which, you know, Amazon may well do a very good job on, but it just struck me that the timing when he's our big hope in many big moments that we've seen on film, you think, where's Bond? And now I don't know whether he's in a warehouse for Amazon, but he's gone to Amazon, which just struck me strange timing.
I just glimpsed that headline. Does that mean losing Bond, though? Or does it just mean maybe there's just more spin-offs and Q, as you say, maybe there's a Q series, but you're still going to have Bond at the middle of it. It's not like Star Wars that went off in so many directions. There was no central thing, was there?
But I guess the question is, you know, once you lose those people that have been behind it and have had that sort of, they've steered Bond through the years, and, you know, they've come up with the new inventions, and the British element's very strong. Does that all get lost? You know, does some of that almost flag waving, I suppose, that bit of the sort of establishment of which Bond was part of,
and also
does that go?
They haven't released that many, so it's been quite a sort of special moment when there's a new Bond movie. It's a big thing, isn't it? And it's only every few years.
Yeah, I'm a big Bond fan, aren't you, Rachel?
Yeah, I love Bond.
Yeah, well, here's to it. Let's hope it keeps its basic integrity. What's your thought for the day? Well,
mine is actually not about James Bond, I'm afraid. It's about the mini Elon Musk. Elon Musk's 4-year-old son, Ash A12, I think his name is pronounced, although it's written a load of squiggles. But I've been slightly obsessed this week by whether or not he did tell Donald Trump to shush up when he went in that press conference where they went, and he was sitting on Elon Musk's shoulder. And then we know for sure he definitely picked his nose and wiped the bogey on the desk because we could see it. But there's been this speculation about, did he tell the president to shush up? And if so, I was just thinking, actually, is he then reflecting what his father's saying? It's a little bit like the parrot who reveals the crime by saying the words of the villain just before he committed the crime. And then I thought, actually, this is exactly what's been going on with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. He's kind of now a bit like, if that is what X did, he's now parroting the Putin line. Anyway, it just got me thinking. I've been rather obsessed by exactly what this little boy did or didn't say.
Yeah. Do you think he was sighing about his dad going, "You're not the president, shush," as his dad was talking?
Or his dad has said to him, "I wish that man would shut up." And, you know.
I mean, I never know whether it'll be quite what I see on social media, but it looked pretty clear. Yeah. And Donald Trump, sitting behind the Resolute desk, he certainly looked a little bit hats off,
absolutely
didn't he?
Furious, didn't he? Right. But also, what is going to happen to that boy? I feel sorry for him.
I don't know. You get the impression that Elon rather indulges it, right? To let him do precisely what he likes, if anything. I'm making this up there. He might have quite liked his son taking the Mickey out.
I would have thought he would, but Donald Trump certainly didn't.
That's right. Okay, let's talk about Donald Trump and about Ukraine and the way that story moves on at just extraordinary pace. Just a few samples of some of the conversations today. The former special envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker, joined me, and he shared some of his thoughts on what his former boss had been saying.
It's unnecessary. It's just, you know, we, as I was saying earlier,
it didn't have to happen. What did you find it embarrassing? I'm just curious on that.
Because I didn't make the statement, so it doesn't embarrass me. No. but it is the wrong kind of statement to be making, because it is just not reflective of the reality, and it is creating a wedge between the U.S. and our allies and Ukrainians when we need to be working together. It is giving encouragement to Russia when we ought to be putting pressure on Putin. So it's just it's an own goal, as you would say in the UK.
Right, the former Ukraine-American envoy there, with Donald Trump saying it was Ukraine that started the war, driving a wedge between the allies of the Western Alliance, strengthening Russia. He was not impressed. I also spoke to the chair in Kyiv of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Ukrainian Parliament, Alexander Merezhko. He said that he was optimistic despite what he's been seeing.
Well, I can only make some guesses, but luckily we continue to enjoy support of the United Kingdom. And, you know, in this crucial time, we started to see who is our reliable friend. At the same time, I would like to pay attention that I read, for example, statements by some Republicans, and they support Ukraine. So we are lucky to have friends among the Democrats, among Republicans in the U.S. Congress. And maybe we need to be a little bit patient and to understand, to see what's really going on. What is Mr. Trump is up to?
Right. Ben Hodges, last bit of an extract from earlier on. He's a former commanding general of the American Army in Europe. He told me that what we're looking at now is a test for senior leaders under Donald Trump.
What I hope is that the most senior leaders are also performing their duty of giving their best professional military advice to the civilian leadership, even if it's not requested, to explain, you know, what is going on, what the risks are, what the damage to American security if the alliance is seen as no longer viable. This is a test for our senior leaders. Do they have the courage to be able to push back on the secretary or the president, at least in private, until they receive a legal order?
U.S. General Ben Hodges there. Now, look, I want to get your thoughts, Rachel and Joe, on the opinion poll that was carried out for Times Radio on the question, should people stand up to Donald Trump and criticise him? The answer was, half of people thought the answer was yes, they would like to stand up, see others stand up to Donald Trump. Only 30% of people said no, that was not what they wanted to see. So, straightforward first question then, guys. Rachel, should Keir Starmer stand up to Trump when he goes to the White House next week?
He's got to stand up for the truth. It doesn't mean having a huge sort of bust up, that kind of Love Actually moment that we talked about last week, where he kind of humiliates him in front of the whole world. But I think he's got to stand up for the truth, for values. This isn't just about sort of a trade deal or diplomatic ties. It's about fundamental questions of values and sort of morality. And it's simply not true that Zelensky's a dictator.
Yes.
You know, it's simply not true that Ukraine started that. And it's really fundamental that Keir Starmer really makes that clear and stands up for, you know, what is really a fundamental thing about Western democracy, which is the truth.
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer did say that, didn't he, in a statement yesterday, that Russia was the aggressor in Ukraine. I mean, it's not any other argument. Anyone who contradicts that is just running against reason, common sense, as well as the obvious facts. But Keir Starmer did say that. Likewise, he just brushed aside the idea that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator. He's an elected leader. So when you say you want to see him stand up to Donald Trump, imagine, you know, we're looking at the podiums in the White House. What sort of thing do you want to hear from Keir Starmer when that time comes?
I think he doesn't have to have a huge bust up, but I think he needs to be a little bit more challenging, if not confrontational. And I think that's what the British public would expect. I mean, I thought it was fascinating, the polling. In America, there's much more division between Republicans and Democrats over what actually is going on in Ukraine and what America should do. But in this country, there's overwhelming clarity about the facts and what happened. And I think people will expect Starmer to sort of make that clear and distance himself in public if necessary. And I think also he can't have his cake and eat it when it comes to EU and the US. There's got to be now, I think, you know, he talks about being a bridge, but Donald Trump has pretty much blown up that bridge from his end. So it's, you know, he's really got to now build alliances with other European countries. Okay,
I want to develop on some of that in just a moment. But Joe, your thought, do you agree with the 50% who say we should stand up to Trump, or people should stand up to Trump, or the 30 who just aren't so sure about that? What do you think?
Well, I think we are at an interesting time. I think that the idea that Keir Starmer is going to be a bridge, I think he's more like Stretch Armstrong at the moment, that kind of little figure that you used to sort of pull in all directions and, you know, till it would to breaking point, or I think generally you never break Stretch Armstrong, that little figure. And I think for Keir Starmer, it's this, he has got probably splinters in incredibly difficult places because he's having to do this incredible balancing act. But the problem is we can say now what we think he should do, but in reality, everything is changing so fast. The words that are coming out, something you criticise Trump for today, it could be something completely different by next week. Just interestingly, while we've been on air, I saw the White House press conference, the news conference had started with Caroline Leavitt, and she said that next week, she was announcing what was happening next week, and she announced Macron first. And then Keir Starmer. Now, we all thought Keir Starmer was first, and it's very interesting. I don't know if that's deliberate or whether it's the billing in which they're giving Macron over Starmer, or whether actually Macron is there first. I'm not sure of the choreography, but it was just interesting that was the way it was presented. And
we do get a bit obsessed with these things, don't we? This sort of scramble to be one of the first through the door, or faster than the leader behind.
But it's about the tone, isn't it? Because the issue is Macron is therefore going to be the first one in the room having... What tone is he going to set? Because then that sort of sets the way for what Starmer does or doesn't do. Because if Macron dodges it, then is Starmer going to be really brave enough to go ahead and say... And we've been working quite closely with the French, it appears. You know, they had their nice little get together at Chequers recently. There was lots of hugs on the steps, and it appears that that's probably one of the stronger relationships in the sort of European mix at the moment. So it is gonna, it's not necessarily that if you are sort of setting the chessboard out now that Keir Starmer's even in position to do that, because he's probably spoken to Macron about what Macron's going to be doing. They're probably going to be on a hotline WhatsApping furiously about each element of this. And then, of course, things could move pretty quickly because we know that Trump will just completely pull the rug in the middle of a press conference. You could be live. You could have war gamed this with your team, and then you're stuck there not knowing what to do. And you do get back to that, effectively, the Love Actually moment where it doesn't really matter what you've planned. It's how it then looks in the room. And you know, we know that there will be retaliation for anybody that steps up and you know, stands up to Trump. But the big question that for me is hanging out there, and I've started to sort of hear rumblings of it, I've heard a few analysts are starting to make noises, is what is the potential backlash for America? So this idea in the Middle East that they're all going to take everyone from Gaza, not everyone in the Middle East is overly happy about that. And then if you get this very bombastic continuation of this sort of language that comes from Trump, if Trump then starts to have some sort of backlash against any leaders in their countries that do anything, if it's retaliatory around tariffs, for example, or something else, is there then potential sort of boycotts of American brands? Is there a sort of, do consumers start to rise up? Do those of us that had Ukrainian refugees that came over and lived with us for a time, as I did, do we then start to make a choice and say, you know, I stood in a bar where someone said they wouldn't buy Russian vodka after what happened.
Well, on the level of the high street, we saw in Canada, there were the Canadian whiskey was just cleaned off the shelves. Everyone, and the American bourbon, Kentucky bourbon, was just sitting there. No one was touching it. You can imagine consumers at that level making up their own mind. Interesting in the Wall Street Journal today. If you look at the opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, which is an interesting, you know, influential conservative leading newspaper, they are warning Donald Trump in that article not to jeopardize America's standing, whether it is, you know, with allies, whether it is in world markets, even in the case of Donald Trump's presidency, he may be pushing on the edge and pushing things too far there. I want to talk about that, all of that and more in just a moment with you, Rachel, and you, Joe, here on Pienaar and Friends. I just want to mention this, though, by the way. If you want a sneak preview of tomorrow's Times front page, tune into Times Radio at 10 each evening, and there it is. Every night after 10, we bring you the front page before it's published. And then a little bit later on, 10:30, we go through all the papers with a panel of excellent reviewers every evening right here on Times Radio. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends at 6:18 here on Times Radio.
Early breakfast with
Joe Tanner's here with us on Pienaar and Friends. So is Rachel Sylvester, Times columnist. We're keeping an eye on the White House, watching a live feed coming in from the briefing room in the White House. Mike Waltz, President Trump's national security advisor, is due at the podium, I think, well, at any moment now. We'll be listening to that. We'll cross to that live just to have a listen to what the president's security advisor has to say. It was with keeping an eye on senior cabinet members like Waltz at a time like this. Here in the studio, we're talking about Donald Trump and what's to be done about Donald Trump. What's the best way of dealing with Donald Trump? Do you stand up to Donald Trump if you're Keir Starmer next week on his way to the White House? And so, by the way, is Emmanuel Macron, the French president. So let's pick up on a couple of those points there, Rachel and Joe. Donald Trump, I think you could argue, is shameless. You're not going to shame him if you're Keir Starmer, if you're anybody else. And so it might be, well, the most you're going to get out of it is something counterproductive, some sort of backlash. But it's your point that that's not the point.
Exactly. I think you're standing up for what you believe in. And I wonder, why don't Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer go together? So there's this whole sort of song and dance about who's going to be in the door first. But actually, imagine that show of strength from Europe to say, you know, this is what the truth is. This is what we're bringing to, you know, you, Donald Trump, but also this is what we need from you. And, you know, rather than having this kind of slightly ridiculous choreography of who's in the door first and who can get that first handshake, you know, they need to have a bit of a show of strength, I think.
It's an interesting point, Joe, isn't it? I mean, you made the point a moment ago. You just spotted, I think, did it just come out that Emmanuel Macron is going to be in the Oval Office first? Well, sitting at that fire, presumably with a roaring fire, chatting to Donald Trump with or without a cup of coffee. Rachel's point there is, one hopes, wouldn't you, that the two leaders are coordinating very, very closely, maybe coordinating their messages so they complement each other in their almost back-to-back meetings rather than competing to see who's the strongest bridge or who's the tallest poppy on the European side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, it was Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, was just saying that sort of basically they're doing this press conference the news briefing that they hold in the White House is just a sort of, it's running through how great the first month's been, you know, how many people tuned in to watch the inauguration, right through to, you know, the numbers of things that they've been able to do, the exec orders, etc. So they're doing a bit of a sort of stock take or a report card, I suppose, and they've got a series of people that are talking. And just as she opened it, she's just said, you know, we've got a next week, and then she said President Macron from France, and also, and it was sort of an also or Sir Keir Starmer from the UK is also going to be there, and it was this sort of secondary position of Keir Starmer, which I agree to your earlier point. I don't think it particularly matters, and to some extent, I would argue that I think it's actually helpful because you could have someone else go in and sort of do the reconnaissance mission and sort of find out really where's he at, really what are the hard lines. Is it that Trump has misunderstood something? As I was talking to somebody today who was explaining that, you know, there seems to be a bit of a mismatch between Putin talking about sovereignty and has Trump sort of taken that to mean land, and that there's potentially there's maybe something's been lost in translation because Donald Trump's all about the deal and about land and property, and is it more that this is about Ukraine becoming a sort of puppet state of Russia? And someone was sort of talking to me about it, and I was saying, but how do you deal with that? You know, is it that you have to have a face-to-face conversation and actually really interrogate somebody to work out if that is a mistake, or actually it's just the way it's being spoken about is different, but they mean the same thing. So maybe Macron will have a very clever role to play, and maybe Keir Starmer can use that info to do something with. I don't know. Okay, we're going to carry on with this conversation and talk to colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic in the course of this. But first, I want to cross live now to the White House, where Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, is at the podium. Let's just listen in.
What a month. And what a sea change in our foreign policy, in addition to what we're doing on the border and restoring American sovereignty, in addition to what we're doing in our economy and the job creation and the inflation reduction. We are bringing the world back to where it was at the end of President Trump's first term, which is a world of peace, prosperity, and looking forward, and getting us out of the chaos that we've just seen over the last 4 years. So over the last month, just to name a few, I had the honor of sitting in the Oval Office as President Trump spoke with President Putin, and then immediately spoke with President Zelensky, and both of them said only President Trump could bring both sides to the table, and only President Trump could stop the horrific fighting that has been going on now for the better part of 4 years, and that only President Trump could drive the world back to peace. Both of those leaders said that in back-to-back calls. And of course, we just had our historic talks mediated by our good friends and partners, Saudi Arabia. We give great thanks to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for hosting, and sat down for the first time in years with the Russians and talked about a path forward with peace. On top of that, and one of the things that led to that was the tremendous confidence building measure that we had with the release of Mark Fogel. I'll remind everyone, the last time that we had an American released from the Russians, either we gave up a deadly spy, pressured our allies to give up a lethal killer, or we released, under the Biden administration, the world's most notorious arms dealer, Victor Bout, who, by the way, had one of his main clients for arms, the cartels in Mexico and Central America. We gave up none of that. This was released as a confidence-building measure, working with our great Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, and our Secretary of State as a first step towards opening these talks and then moving forward towards peace. On top of that, we've secured, just in a month, the return of 12 American hostages from Russia, from Bulgaria, from Venezuela, the Taliban, and Hamas. Excuse me, that's from Belarus, not Bulgaria. We also had, for the first time in quite some time, we took out a senior leader of ISIS, an international financier and recruiter that the military had been trying to take out for quite some time, and wasn't able to do so, frankly, because of a bureaucratic approval process. President Trump said, take him out, and that ISIS financier and leader is no longer on this earth. We've also taken action to eliminate other terrorist organizations.
We're going to put away from that live feed from the White House briefing room there. Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor there at the podium. We expect to be taking questions in a moment. I'm keen to have a listen in on that and to see what emerges when the questions are thrown at that senior member of the Trump cabinet. For now, though, just listening to that, Joe and Rachel, he said he was in the room when President Trump was having those calls, first with Vladimir Putin and then later with Volodymyr Zelensky. He said both of those leaders made the point that only Trump could deliver peace. I mean, so far, you could say maybe there's something of a point in that. Donald Trump has the clout, the power to act as a catalyst for change in Ukraine. He didn't go on to address the question of on what terms.
Well, exactly. At what cost? So, they say they got this hostage, this prisoner out for free, supposedly, but actually the Russians got a huge amount out of it. They got to sit across the table from the Americans, back in from the cold. And I was really thinking earlier today, we spoke to Sir John Scarlett, the former head of MI6, recently for the Crime and Justice Commission, about the sort of terrorist threat. And he was talking about how actually you still do have a very real, clear and present danger from states like Russia. And he said, you just have to remember that Russia consider themselves to be at war with the West, was his phrase. And for this sort of what's described as a sea change in our foreign policy from the Americans, completely fails to take into account what's happened in Russia and what Russia are behaving like. And that sense of, I just wonder what the intelligence agencies, what the security services, what the Five Eyes are thinking about this shift. Because actually there has been this sense of Russia being at war with the West. And you've seen Litvinenko killed, you've seen the Skripal's attacks on sort of Western soil, on British soil.
Peace at any price
Exactly.
is not something... Well, there's a perfectly coherent principled position of pacifism which says that nothing is worth going to war for. That is no part of the American argument. They're saying that peace is the end, justifies all that goes before it, and all that goes before it that we've seen so far, as far as they're concerned, is fully justified. And that's where the argument really takes off. Ukraine is defending its territory, defending itself from an illegal invasion. We don't even see the president accepting the notion of an illegal invasion on the part of Russia.
And I think that the problem that it gives to everyone else, and particularly us. I was on a podcast, Whitehall Sources, this week, where we spoke to Sir David Manning, and as a leading foreign policy expert, and he actually said that what's going on now is a question over really the fact that we're probably at breaking point. We're at break point on the UK-US special relationship. And that he actually said that if we find that we have a president who doesn't share the values that have been central to our relationship for 70 years, it will be difficult to go on saying there is something particularly special about it. And that is a real problem, because that's what it comes down to. It comes down to whether you share values with other countries. And yes, they might change slightly with leaders, but they don't change that much.
Or more materially, exchanging and sharing such things as vital intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean, you could certainly argue pretty persuasively that the idea of a special relationship has been overblown for not just for years but for decades. It's something which everyone pays tribute to whenever a prime minister, and they all have, and it'll probably happen next week when Donald Trump stands next to Keir Starmer. They'll both be talking about the special relationship. What would it really mean, now at all times? But when you have David Manning, Joe, telling you what he said there, you mentioned the Five Eyes relationship between the main security partners of the Western Alliance. Are we going to get to the point where our intelligence agency in this country, MI6, French intelligence, Canadian intelligence, and all the rest, just don't feel they can share that stuff?
And it's all about trust, isn't it? So we think, actually, whoever's in the White House and in number 10, there's a kind of deep state that still keeps that special relationship going. But there comes a point, I think, particularly with intelligence, where that people begin to think it's too dangerous. I was just, if the former head of MI6 is saying Russia sees itself as at war with the West, are they going to think, the bridge really is from Washington to Moscow? It's not from Washington to Europe. Okay. And what's going to be walking over that bridge?
Okay, more to discuss. And more, look, we want to hear what you're thinking about all of this. Do share. Send me a text, send me a tweet. Join in the conversation. We'll keep up the conversation after the news here on Pienaar and Friends with Mike Powell. Across
Is Times Radio.
And here with us on Pienaar and Friends, Joe Tanner and Rachel Sylvester. And Kate's popped by to tell us about her show, which starts at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. We've had a tweet from Musk. I actually feel a little bit cheap coming in here and saying we've had a tweet from Donald, a tweet. We've had an X from Elon Musk, the owner of X. But of course, every time someone says something, whether it's J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, whoever it is, it's extraordinary. And it either doubles down on the first opinion expressed by either one of those three, or it moves it along a bit. And Elon Musk has taken to X to say that President Zelensky is despised by Ukrainians. I think we know that's not true. We were on the ground in Kyiv ourselves last night speaking to a reporter there, and we know that that is not true. But he basically says he's despised by the people of Ukraine, which is why he's refused to hold an election. He claimed he was relying on a Zelensky-controlled poll to prove his popularity. This is the Ukrainian president citing a right-wing account. Musk added Trump is right to ignore him and solve for peace independent of the disgusting, massive graft machine feeding off the dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, it's bordering on tasteless as well, isn't it? And
right, it is tasteless.
Yes,
and the
it is
opinion
tasteless.
The opinion poll that gave Zelensky a 57% rating was a respectable poll.
The Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. I can reveal as well, I'm getting reports that Elon Musk will be speaking at CPAC this evening about 9:15. So we'll take that in our show if that happens as planned.
Is he going to have his little son X there?
Well, probably, because X is Elon Musk's stage prop, isn't he? And if it all goes a bit wrong, he can just, make a funny joke or, pick his nose.
I bet he's hoping for a bigger crowd. Apparently Liz Truss was talking to a half-empty room earlier.
Well, do you know
How
what?
big a room?
Well, there were a lot of empty seats, is all I'd say.
Was there a bit more echo than applause, maybe? We'll actually talk about Liz Truss later on, because she said we need a UK version of MAGA. Now, look, I mean, MAGA people might turn their nose up at it, but I am interested in this collective force behind something that's meant to be for the good of the country, make America great again. And so I'm interested in whether our politics here is so divided that actually we could do with a unifying movement. Is that exactly what we need at the moment?
Well, it's in the nature of politics to have a unifying movement that crosses party lines.
And I don't think MAGA is very unifying.
No,
So what would we call it?
I'm sort of using the movement behind it as in the sort of collective fight for one thing, making America great again, rather than all the kind of awful splinter.
But everyone would
elements of it.
argue for probably about 6 months over what to call it. Because would it be Make England great again? Would it be Make Great Britain, UK? And the whole thing just becomes very tricky.
Who knows?
Okay. Also quite difficult to argue with the potential that Britain should be great, or even great.
We put it in our name.
We are
put it in our name to try
far
and
too
keep
self-effacing to be great again. It would have to be Make Britain all right again, wouldn't it? Okay, mildly fine.
Wasn't our version Take Back Control?
Yeah,
well, we did, didn't we?
Yeah.
Make Britain all right again. M-bag. We'll Kate Borsay in
You
at
need
7.
to read out the WhatsApp
I'm
number
looking
now for
forward to
everyone to send in their suggestions of what it will be.
Now, here on Pienaar and Friends, I've got an eye on the White House briefing room where Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, is still at the podium. He's been taking questions from the media. Let's cross back to Washington, D.C. and the White House and hear how that's going.
Question is about Ukraine. Sure. For about more than 10 years, I've been fascinated, like many, with what's going on. Was in Northern Europe, working out of the Baltics when Crimea was annexed, and was a lot of this came on Twitter. The platform used to be known as Twitter. Was a lot of European leaders would talk about their disappointment and solidarity with Ukraine. But when it came to actually doing something, it felt like they were passing a hot potato and sent it over the Atlantic. I wonder how much of what we're seeing right now out of the administration of President Trump is a call to Europe and the European leaders and the allies that we've traditionally had to pick up that hot potato and start doing something a little bit more concrete to win and preserve the peace in Ukraine. The second question I have is, it's related, is there's been a lot of speculation that President Trump and the administration might be manipulated by Vladimir Putin. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the administration's posture and your confidence in the competence of this administration to go toe-to-toe with Vladimir Putin.
Well, I'll take the second question first. If there's anybody in this world that can go toe-to-toe with Putin, that could go toe-to-toe with Xi, that could go toe-to-toe with Kim Jong-un, and we could keep going down the list. It's Donald J. Trump. He is the deal maker in chief. There is no question that he is the commander in chief. And I, for one, and I think all Americans and around the world should have no doubt about his ability to not only handle Putin, but to handle the complexity of driving this war to an end. And then on your first piece on Europe, I'll take you back to 2014. You're right, there was a lot of hand-wringing in Europe and not a lot of action. There's also a lot of hand-wringing here in Washington under the Obama administration and not a lot of action. They literally threw blankets at the problem. And so I'll remind everyone that Putin had some type of conflict, invasion, or issue with their neighbor under President Bush with Georgia, under President Obama with Ukraine 2014, not under President Trump 45, and again with President Biden in 2022. The war should have been deterred. The war should have never happened, and I have no doubt it would not have happened under President Trump and will stop under President Trump again. But I just want to push back on this notion of our European allies not being consulted as we've entered into this process. I already mentioned the immediate phone call President Trump made to President Zelensky. He has talked to President Macron of France repeatedly last week. President Macron convened European leaders and then is coming here on Monday. Prime Minister Starmer is coming next Thursday. I've talked to every one of my national security advisor counterparts across the spectrum in Europe. I've talked to Secretary General Rutte, the leader of NATO, the Secretary General of NATO. We have repeatedly, by the way, we had half our cabinet, 7 cabinet officials, including the vice president, at the Munich Security Conference, all engaging, all listening, and all making sure our allies are heard. However, we've also made it clear for years, decades even, that it is unacceptable that the United States and the United States taxpayer continues to bear the burden, not only of the cost of the war in Ukraine, but of the defense of Europe. We fully support our NATO allies. We fully support the Article 5 commitment, but it's time for our European allies to step up. And one of the things that Secretary General Rutte said on our call was, this last couple of weeks have been a real wake-up call. And I asked him, what have you been missing the last couple of years? The fact that we are going to enter into a NATO summit this June with a third of our NATO allies still not meeting the 2% minimum, a commitment they made a decade ago, literally a decade ago, with a war on their doorstep, the largest war that they're all extremely concerned about, but yet it's, well, somebody else needs to pay. We've got other domestic priorities. It's unacceptable. President Trump's made that clear. And the minimum needs to be met. We need to be at 100% in this June at the NATO summit. And then let's talk about exceeding it, which is what President Trump has been talking about with 5% of GDP. Europe needs to step up for their own defense as a partner, and we can be friends and allies and have those tough conversations.
Okay, that's Mike Walsh, the National Security Advisor in the White House, taking questions in the briefing room there. In some ways echoing elements of Donald Trump's messages that it's time, he said, for the European partners to step up and take more of the burden of defending and paying for the defense of Ukraine. Likewise, for the defense of Europe, being borne by America. He argued there, not the first one by any means to make that point, not the first one in American politics on either side of the aisle to make that point. He did not repeat the point about Ukraine being the one who instigated the war. By the way, we're going to pick up some of those threads, and we're going to be talking to Molly Ball, happy to say, in just a moment, from the Wall Street Journal, one of our favourite commentators, here on Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio. The money. Joe Tanner, political strategist, and Rachel Sylvester, Times columnist, here with me on Pienaar and Friends. And Molly Ball is on the line from the Wall Street Journal, on the line from stateside. Hello to you, Molly. Welcome back.
Hi, John. Great to be here. How
Good.
you doing?
Always good to have you, Molly. Can you just look, since yesterday, it seems like a long time ago, but it was only yesterday, about this time we had a conversation. Since then, just give us your take on how this debate, argument about Ukraine has been playing out.
Well, it's not much of a debate. We have had, certainly Trump's comments about Zelensky made a lot of Republicans squirm. And we've talked about the sort of generational divide in the Republican Party. There have been some Republicans echoing the things that Trump said, but many more of them have come out to say they disagree. Of course, they don't criticize Trump when they say this, but they say, I think Putin is a dictator. I don't think that Zelensky should be described that way. And as we have reported in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the Republicans had no idea this was coming. They were taken by surprise by these comments from Trump, and so they're sort of grappling with how to sort of rationalize them.
Yeah, and where there has been any element of dissent from in the ranks of Republicans, the dissent has been pretty muted, and there's been, loyal support from people who you'd expect to loyally support Donald Trump, people like Josh Hawley. Behind the scenes, Molly, do you get any sense of more private disquiet that isn't being expressed openly?
Well, yes and no. And this was a pattern in Trump's first term as well. You would often hear Republicans, you would also often see Republicans quoted not by name, expressing all kinds of distress and concern. But then when the time came to either put their name to an actual criticism of the president or, heaven forbid, actually do anything, they were suddenly nowhere to be found. And the Republicans in Congress have really perfected that art for the most part of either they will, take issue with the substance Trump of something Trump has said, but be careful not to actually express any direct criticism of the president, or they will, express these feelings privately, but they certainly won't propose to do anything about it. So we have seen an unusually vociferous expression of dissent from some quarters, several Republicans saying with their names on it that they disagree with what Trump has said. Yeah. But that's about where it ends, because all they have said is that they disagree.
All right. Rachel Sylvester and Joe Tanner are here with me in the studio. Molly, Rachel.
So fascinating, Molly. Who do you think is going to become the sort of main voice of opposition, if you like, to Trump, either within the Republican Party or actually the Democrats? They just feel from over this side of the Atlantic as if they're a total vacuum at the moment. Is there anyone who's emerging on the Democrat side that is really able to stand up to him strongly? Or if not within the Republicans, who is it going to be?
All of the Republicans who dislike Trump have been purged and are not considered Republicans anymore, and certainly do not have seats in Congress. There are some moderates, some from more sort of swing districts, who will sometimes put some distance between themselves and the president, but there are certainly no full-throated Trump critics, the likes of, a Liz Cheney that we might have seen in yesteryear. Mitch McConnell was once the leader of the Senate Republicans. He and Trump are not friends, and McConnell has voted against several of Trump's nominees. However, McConnell is no longer the Republican leader, and in fact, he announced today that he does not plan to run for re-election when his term ends in a couple of years. So there really are not voices against Trump in the Republican Party as currently constituted. The Democrats are going through quite a lot of angst and recrimination right now, because they too feel that they are not able to oppose Trump in a strong way that would represent, their views and those of their base. And a lot of Democratic activists and rank and file Democrats from across the country are beside themselves, feeling like their leaders are not doing enough to stand up for the things that they believe in. I would just say that I cut them a bit of a break just because they don't have any real standing to do so, right? They don't have the majority in the House or the Senate. They can vote against everything Trump does, and in fact have voted against most of his nominees and given quite forceful speeches about how horrible they are, but they just don't have the sort of hard power to make that matter. And so, they can yell and scream all they want, but it doesn't do anything.
Just throwing in this from our listener, Charlie, who's written in, listening there to Mike Waltz. He says, listening to the US National Security Advisor is making my skin itch. He mentioned Article 5, referring to the article of the NATO treaty, where one member is under threat or attacked and all members take it as an attack and run to defend. He said he mentioned Article 5 without talking about NATO contributions when it was European nations that helped enact Article 5 after 9/11. Simple fact. The only time that Article 5 has been invoked since NATO was created and that charter was put together was after 9/11, and it was European nations in support of America after that attack on American soil. Charlie's thought there. Do keep them coming. And Joe Tanner, you've got a question, Joe?
Yeah, Molly, is there? Do you think there's potential for sort of the former presidents to kind of come out and say something quite punchy off the back of this, or do you think they're all kind of just thinking, it's not our problem anymore, we can't control him, so there's no point?
I think it's more likely the latter. Look, I mean, part of me feels like I'm in a time warp to 2017 or 2018 in Trump's first term, when he would say or do something outrageous, and there was this chorus of, isn't somebody going to say how horrible this is? Where are, X, Y, and Z office holders? Where are the Republicans? But at this point, everyone's been sort of beaten into submission who might lodge some kind of complaint. Either they have realized that their position is relatively unpopular compared to the president's. After all, he has the overwhelming support of the Republican base. They may not all agree with him on every issue, but they very much want him to pursue the philosophies that he campaigned on. And so particularly among Republicans, there's a feeling that the people have spoken. And you can continue to speak up with criticisms here and there. But fundamentally, it's only been 1 month of this second Trump presidency, and he won the election. He sort of gets to do the things he promised.
And he says what he wants to say, and he seems to mean what he says. I mean, today, Molly, we've been getting the news in just before we came on air, that the G7 each time at this time put out a statement of support for Ukraine. That's been the pattern since the invasion of Ukraine. Reported now that G7 motion was blocked by America because it mentioned Russia as being the aggressor in Ukraine. Which, Rachel's shaking her head. I can well see why. And then we learned just a moment later on that at the United Nations in New York, same thing had occurred. America was standing in the way of a motion of support for Ukraine on the basis that Russia was named as the aggressor. Now, in one way, Molly, I guess that's simply consistent with what Donald Trump said and posted yesterday. But it does, I guess, seem to eliminate the idea that this is something which may be modified or walked back by Donald Trump. It suggests he means exactly what he said. It's now embedded in American policy.
And that actually is a major shift from the first Trump administration. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because in the first Trump administration, the president would often say things that then were not carried out by those around him. He didn't have a J.D. Vance in his administration. He had Mike Pence, who had quite different views, particularly on foreign policy. And Pence is someone who, although he doesn't have any particular power, has been outspoken in criticizing Trump on this issue. So the difference is that Trump has really surrounded himself with a cabinet and a staff and a group of people to implement his vision who think that he's right and that he should pursue these things that he talks about. So in the first Trump administration, you had the likes of a John Bolton or a Nikki Haley, a lot, and many Republicans would point out at the time, they would say, oh, sure, you can criticize the president's rhetoric, but if you look at what he's actually done, he's been quite tough on Russia. He's been quite hard on Putin. And look at all of these measures the administration has taken, up to and including sending the first arms to Ukraine. So I think that's a very different dynamic in this administration, that you don't have those more traditional Republicans around Trump to arguably undermine the things that he would like to do. Instead, they are much more loyal and much more focused on actually implementing his vision.
Yeah, I sort of get this bit of an update before we go much further, because General Kellogg, Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, was in Ukraine. He met Volodymyr Zelensky earlier on in the day. We were expecting a news conference, which I think we were all anticipating with some, it could have been really interesting, there wasn't a news conference. It was cancelled, apparently at the behest of the American side. But Joe, you've spotted a posting on social media from Volodymyr Zelensky about that, which really caught your attention. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so, in the same way that Trump has sort of been sort of posting stuff about, the backdrop of conversations, we didn't have this press conference. And then President Zelensky actually released a statement, it appears online, where he said he had a productive meeting with General Kellogg, a good discussion, many important details, and then said, I'm grateful to the United States for all the assistance and bipartisan support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. It's important for us and for the entire free world that American strength is felt. We had a detailed conversation about the battlefield situation, how to return our prisoners of war and effective security guarantees. But I thought this was quite interesting. He said, from the very first second of this war, Ukraine has sought peace. We must and can ensure that peace is strong and lasting so that Russia can never return with war. Ukraine is ready for a strong, effective investment and security agreement with the President of the United States. We have proposed the fastest and most constructive way to achieve results. Our team is ready to work 24/7. Success unites us all. Strong Ukraine-US relations benefit the entire world. And then thanks General Kellogg for the joint work. So, considering where we've got to in this sort of trading of insults effectively, to then suggest, and to the wording of effective investment, I thought was quite interesting, given this idea about minerals being at stake and this, this point about money that, Trump, the deal maker, just seemed to be interesting timing. And I wonder if a lot of those words are going to be poured over, but almost felt like something the Americans could have written for Zelensky to have to put out. Yeah,
Zelensky, look, he doesn't want to fall out, does he, with Donald Trump more than strictly necessary. It's proved almost impossible to avoid something of a falling out after that blistering attack from the president, where there was triggered by Zelensky talking about the president being a bubble of disinformation. But here, he does not want to go further than he absolutely needs to. Before we go on, we're getting close to the end of our time. Just have a listen to this, because the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, in the White House briefing room, he was asked who the administration blames for the war, Zelensky or President Putin.
Well, look, his goal, Peter, is to bring this war to an end, period. And there has been ongoing fighting on both sides. It is World War I style trench warfare. His frustration with President Zelensky is that you've heard is multifold. One, there needs to be a deep appreciation for what the American people, what the American taxpayer, what President Trump did in his first term, and what we've done since. So some of the rhetoric coming out of Kyiv, frankly, and insults to President Trump were unacceptable, number one. Number two, our own Secretary of Treasury personally made the trip to offer the Ukrainians what can only be described as a historic opportunity. That is for America to co-invest with Ukraine in their minerals, in their resources, to truly grow the pie.
So that's Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor there at the White House briefing room. I mean, picking up the point that he thought Zelensky had handled it badly. He accused him of insulting Donald Trump. I didn't hear him there repeating explicitly the idea that it was Ukraine that started the war. You wonder, is that a perfect meeting of minds between the advisor and his boss, the president? Maybe we'll look at that as this story develops over time. Molly Ball, though, again, always really grateful to hear from you on the show. Joe and Rachel, thank you so much for coming along. Emily Leahy was our producer, technical operator Isaac Marley. I'm going to be back on Monday, and Kate Boss is up next on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great weekend. It is 7 o'clock. This is Kate Borsay and the Evening Edition coming up.
It's going to take a smart statesman to figure this stuff out, but we've got that in the White House, and I really believe that we're on the cusp of peace in Europe for the first time in 3 years.
US Vice President J.D. Vance says peace in Europe is within reach thanks to Donald Trump. We'll get reaction from Ukrainian and American experts about how realistic that is. Plus, in the UK, the Chancellor says she's absolutely committed to